All right, folks. I think we can get started here. Thanks, everyone, for joining this X, formerly known as Twitter, space. I am Fire's Executive Vice President, Nico, here with my boss, Fire President and CEO, Greg Lukianoff. Greg, how's it going?
A little busy.
A little busy? Yeah. How was your weekend? Did you get some nice rest and relaxation?
Oh, totally. Nothing happened. Yeah, it was kind of crazy, particularly after the Bill Maher thing on Friday. That was breakneck because I had to get home to my kid's birthday party. And then almost as soon as we got home, it all started up with the, University of Pennsylvania president stepping down. And it's been just madness. Honestly, it's been madness ever since the hearings last week.
Yeah, we were originally going to do this about your new book, The Canceling of the American Mind, which, of course, you were on Bill Maher's show to discuss. But
which everyone should purchase, because basically right now what's happening is a lot of schools are going, you know what, maybe we should regulate speech more. And I'm kind of like, you already have been regulating speech like crazy people, and it's been a disaster. The solution can't be do more of what you're doing.
It's funny. We can't really have a conversation right now about any of Fire's issues without bringing up what's happened over the last week, but really over the last 2 months since the attacks on October 7th. We were doing a webinar for our top supporters, our Ember Club members, about Fire's kind of growth and successes and sometimes, in some cases, failures since our expansion in June of 2022. But all anyone wanted to talk about, and justifiably so, is what's been going on. Now, Greg, you know what the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is like on campus, the passions it arises. We have the saying at Fire that we will drive this organization into the wall if it means staying principled. And that phrase, I believe, came in the context of this conflict. So you want to talk a little bit about the history there?
Not actually out of specifically this conflict, but when I start good training for this, and Ricky Schlott, my co-author of Canceling of the American Mind, a 23-year-old genius, she remembers me talking about how my first cases were all about 9/11 and about, oof, that must have been hard. That's some unsympathetic speech to be defending. And honestly, it was great training for getting into the free speech biz, because you got to get used to the fact that if I'm doing my job right, everyone's going to hate me from time to time. And literally first of all, I landed at 9:10 a.m. on September 11th to find an apartment in Philadelphia to be the first legal director of Fire. Got stuck in Philly for a whole week after that because planes weren't flying for a whole week, which younger people aren't even going to know. It was crazy. My very first letter was defending a guy who said anyone who can blow up the Pentagon has my vote. He was joking, but eventually they forced him out. And my very first time on TV was defending Sami Al-Arian, he was a professor at University of South Florida, who they were trying to fire for saying "death to Israel" in a recording from 1989. This is 2001 at this point, by the way. Now, the real claim against Sami Al-Arian was that he had ties to Middle Eastern terrorist groups, but they decided to go with USF decided to go after him for his speech, because they had previously done a whitewash of Sami Al-Arian on the terrorism charge. So they thought they could get away with just firing him for speech. And Fire very early on was like, not on our watch. Meanwhile, though, we knew that this case was, so unsympathetic. And when we first, were asked to take it, we're like, there's no question we're going to take it. And we're a young organization, and might this destroy us by being so unpopular? We're like, well, we're willing to drive this bus into a wall if it means stay principled.
Yeah, I mean, defending the First Amendment can sometimes mean taking on really hard cases at its outer bounds. I mean, sometimes it requires defending offensive, vile, bigoted speech, but there is a long, proud tradition in America of principled civil libertarians defending our core constitutional rights in the most difficult of circumstances. I made a movie, Mighty Ira,
excellent movie, award-winning movie.
Award-winning movie. My colleagues and I worked on that for a number of years. Folks who don't know, Ira Glasser is a former executive director of the ACLU, a non-lawyer, in fact. And while the Skokie case was going on, he was the director of the New York Civil Liberties Union, which had the most Jewish members of any ACLU affiliate in the country at the time. He became executive director of the broader ACLU, the national ACLU, right at the tail end of the Skokie case. But I got to know in the process of making this film some of the lawyers and advocates in the late 70s who, Jewish lawyers and advocates who took on the Skokie case. That defended the rights of neo-Nazis to rally in Skokie, Illinois, then home to, I believe, about 6,000 Holocaust survivors. And why did they do it? Well, they did it because they knew that giving the government the power to censor is a greater danger than letting someone make a total fool of themselves in this case. And they were total fools, these neo-Nazis led by Frank Collin. But we're not here necessarily to explore the past. We are here to discuss the present, and I think we should maybe, Greg, just jump right into discussing that testimony that the three college presidents, the presidents of MIT, Harvard, and Penn, made in Congress last week. I mean, what are your top line thoughts? And we can kind of dig in from there.
I'll put my various hats on. One, as a lawyer, all I could ask myself was who on earth prepped the presidents of Harvard and Penn. I just thought that they really didn't know how to conduct themselves during it. They sometimes got the answers right, but not in a persuasive, convincing, compassionate, compelling way. It just seemed like they just totally flubbed it. Now, so partially just from a competency standpoint, I thought it was a little bit painful. From an answering question, I mean, the fact that they're constantly asked for a yes or no answer by Stefanik on whether or not speech advocating for genocide is protected, yes or no. Part of the initial answer to that is like in the law, particularly First Amendment law, there aren't a lot of yes or no answers.
No.
And we should be thankful that there's not, because if the law was that simple, a lot more innocent people would be going to jail for their speech. And it was also frustrating because it focused so much on the idea of pro-genocide speech, when what they were really talking about were two expressions. One, intifada, students shouting intifada, and two, the expression from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. And while I absolutely understand why those statements are offensive, and I'm very sympathetic to people who think they are, I think they're offensive, I don't think that's what a lot of students think they're shouting. I don't think they're shouting genocide. There's an interesting thing going around on X right now, about a little survey of students being shown the map or where the river is and where the sea is, and coming to the realizations like, oh, you mean get rid of the state? That wasn't what they immediately understood it to mean. And once they actually find out, a lot of students are like, oh, I don't agree with that. That's not my position. But that's being conflated to a scenario in which someone's like, just demanding, kill all Jews. So it's been frustrating that it's happening at a more of an abstract level when the speech in question, shouting intifada and from the river to the sea, is clearly protected. However, one thing that's worth saying, and this is what they were getting at with context, can you have a situation where someone's shouting intifada where it is part of a true threat, or is part of a pattern of discriminatory harassment, or even part of a pattern of incitement? Absolutely. But it does require more. It requires, people have given me the example of, surrounding students and surrounding Jewish students and shouting "kill all Jews." Well, the standard for threats is, would a reasonable person under the circumstances believe that they were in imminent harm of bodily injury or death? And you could make the argument in some of these cases that, yeah, actually that line was crossed. And to the extent to which we have seen people suggesting killing, the one case that I'm familiar of where it was crystal clear that's exactly what they were saying was at Cornell, where a student was arrested for making things that clearly cross the line into threats to kill Jewish students, and that is not protected, nor should it be.
Yeah. Before we continue, Greg, I just want to urge our listeners that if they have questions, they can type them into the chat feature, which I think is at the bottom of your X page, as I am informed by our social media guy. So type those in and they'll be fed to us, and we'll try and answer them throughout this conversation. Yeah, but so the president's answer was, it depends on the context. And that's always the case when we're talking about unprotected
Exactly.
speech, Greg, right? Like it's always a fact-intensive
And
analysis.
and you want it to be. You don't want. So I had a friend, who I love very much, but it was very critical of our take on this because it's like, no, calls for genocide don't require any context. And I talked about the story at Drexel, which is a professor responding to people who were talking about replacement theory, the idea that there's a conspiracy about to replace white people, and that with non-white people, I think, is basically the theory. And his response on Christmas Eve, maybe 2019, I remember
2018,
Christmas
I
Eve,
think.
2018, because it kind of ruined my Christmas Eve, was all I want for Christmas is white genocide. Now, that was a joke. It was not necessarily a joke in great taste, but a joke making fun of great replacement theory. And when I've said this to people, I've occasionally gotten the kind of like, oh yeah, but that wasn't serious. And I'm like, yes, but seriousness is part of context.
Yes.
That is context. Are you more likely to have a situation when someone's actually saying "kill all blank" that could actually cross the line into something that might be interpreted as a true threat? You bet it. You bet it could. But it always relies on context. We don't want there to be a situation where just saying a particular forbidden word, for example, is something that can get you arrested or kicked out of school.
Yeah, and I think all we need to do is pose the hypotheticals, and that case is great, Greg, the case at Drexel, because it's not a hypothetical, right? On its face, It appears to be a call for genocide, but context reveals it to be not quite that. But let's look at the political discourse that's happening right now, where you have people who say that Israel's invasion of Gaza is a genocide against the Palestinians. If you give those in power a broad, abstract speech code that bans general calls for genocide, you can bet it'll be used by opponents of Israel to punish Jewish or Israeli speakers, or vice versa, right? Like the state of Israel, folks say is a genocidal enterprise. And then we've talked internally and on X about like pro-lifers think that abortion is a genocide of the unborn. Trans rights activists sometimes argue that people who believe and advocate only for gender binary are erasing trans people and committing genocide against trans people. You can see, and we've seen this time and time and time again, Greg, and you were the foremost expert about this, that if you give folks a broad speech code that is untethered from the legal standards, it will be used in an arbitrary and discriminatory way to go after political minorities and dissenters on campus.
Yes, absolutely. And our much beloved COO Alicia Glennon, was pointing this out over the weekend as well, as were you and Alex Maury. But I think she said something like, you can be pretty sure this is going to happen. And I'm much more kind of like, no, you can be dead certain it's going to happen. So Wharton, I think, is pursuing something saying that we're going to, ban any genocide-related speech. And I'm like, okay, so
hate speech. No, they want to put in place a hate speech code.
It's just hate speech code. Yeah, it's kind of like, okay, so if your dog in the fight is that you want to make sure that Israel is well represented on campus, then that's going to lead to the disinvitation of pro-Israeli speakers all across the country, because like the belief on campus in many cases, and the argument, of course, is that they jump very quickly to their pro-genocide. And actually, and I will say that like how often the word genocide is used for situations, like the argument that maybe too many kids are receiving, whatever it is, like hormone replacement. That's a form of that. Arguing against that is actually a form of genocide as well. So this will get abused almost immediately and unquestionably.
I mean, that is the lesson of speech codes. In fact, FIRE was founded in the wake of the water buffalo incident at the University of Pennsylvania in 1993. Now, so some of our younger listeners might not be familiar with this story, but in 1993, an Israeli Jewish student, Eden Jacobowitz, was studying in his dorm room, and there was some loud sorority sisters outside the dorm room that were interrupting his and others studying. A bunch of students yelled at them, but Eden yelled, "Shut up, you water buffalo," out of his dorm room window. And the students pressed charges on campus alleging racial harassment. But Eden, being an Israeli Jewish student, was merely translating the Yiddish slang term behema, which is slang for a loud and unruly person. It was not a racial epithet that he was shouting out, and water buffalo hadn't been used or described or thought of as a racial epithet before that. So it just goes to show, and that in that case ended up being taken up by our co-founder Alan Charles Coors, and it was made international news, and the charges were eventually dropped against Eden. But you can just see how these kind of broad amorphous speech codes that are untethered from the legal standards. Now, Penn can have its own speech codes if it wants, but there's wisdom in the jurisprudence of the First Amendment. And there's a reason that these standards are rigorous so that they're not abused. And in the 1980s, one of the first hate speech codes that was put in place on campus was at the University of Michigan. And that speech code was struck down in 1988. And that speech code was put in place, in fact, to protect Black students on campus. But its first victim was a Black student in the School of Social Work. So, if folks are going and looking for expansions of speech codes or looking to censorship as a tool to defeat anti-Semitism on campus, I'd warn that these expansions of censorship are very, very short-sighted. And if the argument is that college administrators are enabling anti-Semitism or Islamophobia, I mean, you could pick any bigotry on campus. Why would you want to give them then the power to exercise censorial tools? I mean, it's just asinine.
Oh, so I know we're not jumping to questions just yet, but I felt like Alley Cat at Nerdcore 84 actually just made a great important point that I want to hit. She writes, can you comment on the risk that universities will take precisely the wrong message from this and tighten speech restrictions rather than reverse their hypocritical limitations on other speech deemed hateful or otherwise problematic? That's the $billion question right now, and that's something that we're all pretty concerned about. Now, the Liz Magill, her first name was Liz, right? Stepping down is something that it's hard for free speech advocates to feel bad about. Penn very much earned its next to bottom status for free speech in the FIRE free speech rankings in our very rigorous evaluation of 13 different factors to figure out, how good schools are doing on free speech.
And folks can check that out at rankings.thefire.org if they want.
Yes, absolutely. Please do. And of course, after all this stuff happened, after she sort of embarrassed herself in the testimony, she decided to go public with the idea that we need to delink the standards from the Penn's policies from constitutional standards. And that would be a complete disaster. It's honestly one of the scariest things from a free speech perspective I've heard come out of the mouth of an elite college president. And so when she stepped down, there can be no way we can sort of lament this. Also, some of the people who are demanding that she step down, at least what they're proposing on paper, is the idea of debureaucratizing universities dramatically, which I think is kind of the only way to protect speech. So, we have some qualified hope when it comes to Penn. I'm a little bit more worried about what happens if Claudine Gay is forced to step down. Although Bill Ackman, I got to give it to him, he makes a hell of an argument for her stepping down. Something that is very persuasive, unfortunately, that includes her bad record on free speech, like her role in not standing up for Ronald Sullivan at Harvard several years ago. This was a guy who who actually briefly was part of the team that represented Harvey Weinstein. Now, to people who hear that, who aren't lawyers, there might be a little bit of like, well, yeah, you shouldn't work anywhere if you represent that lowlife. That is not the way lawyers think about that kind of thing. And what enrages me, that's a pretty strong word, but I'm still mad about it at Harvard, is what they needed to do in that circumstance. Because one of my best friends from law school, one of my groomsmen, is a public defender in San Francisco. We don't think of that as like, oh, that's kind of okay if you want to do that. It's kind of gross that you defend guilty people. No, we think of that as noble. Defending odious people, saying that even guilty people need good representation is something that actually we consider noble and commendable in the law. And because Harvard never said that, and this is one of the things that Harvard has screwed up time and time again, like failing to actually come out strongly in favor of people like Carol Hooven or Ronald Sullivan. And so I understand the skepticism of Claudine Gay, and I know that, but I will say this: unlike Magill, Claudine Gay came in and initially said a lot of good things about free speech, partially in response to their bottom of their dead last finish in the FIRE rankings.
And also engagement with the new academic freedom group at Harvard.
Yeah, we see some things that make us a little bit hopeful for Claudine Gay. And if she ends up stepping down, the fear is that will be interpreted as saying, no, you didn't clamp down on freedom of speech enough. Now, but to be clear, no matter what happens at these universities, FIRE is available to for people who want to reform, about ways to reform, to make the environment better for free speech. Because there was this absolutely awful article over the weekend from University of Pennsylvania professor who's supposed to be in charge of academic freedom and free speech, making the now 60-year-old argument that we have to, the problem on campus is too much free speech. It's like, no, most of the things that people are pointing to as problems are the result of censorship, like screaming at each other rather than constructive dialogue is part of the problem of cancel culture. It's something that we make ad nauseum, in Canceling the American Mind. It doesn't really make you nauseous. It's a delightful book. And at the same time, like, a lot of what they're pointing to is actually stuff that they should have been prohibiting anyway. So one of the things that Ackman points out are actual disruptions of classes. No, you don't. You should not be tolerating that. You should not be tolerating shout downs. You should not be tolerating actual incitement, threats, or harassment, vandalism. Certainly, some of the assaults that we've been seeing, because of course, grabbing someone is assault, that should not be tolerated. But the problem is not on campus that there is too much free speech. That's ridiculous.
We should talk just briefly about double standards here, Greg, because I think one of the things that frustrates a lot of folks.
We can't say that enough.
Yeah, one of the things that I think frustrates a lot of people is that these college presidents are falling back on free speech standards now, where their universities were all too eager to censor previously. For example, yes. MIT famously canceled the planned 2020 lecture by University of Chicago professor Dorian Abbott after faculty and graduate students complained about his views on things like affirmative action and certain diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. You mentioned, Greg, Harvard administrators drove out lecturer Carol Hooven for arguing that biological sex is real and promoting her book Testosterone on Fox News. You have Penn. This is like the most bonkers case that I've heard recently. They prohibited a group of students from screening a documentary critical of Israel called Israelism. And the students decided they were going to go ahead and screen it anyway in an act of civil disobedience. They got a faculty member at, I think, like the Middle East Studies Center to reserve the room for them because the university wouldn't give it to them on their own. The leader of that faculty center had to resign as a result of it. And the students, again, in an act of civil disobedience, screened it anyway. To think about that on a college or university campus, to screen a documentary and have a discussion about it needs to be an act of civil disobedience is absurd. And then, of course, you have all these cases where you have got schools like UCLA putting out guidance that says asking someone where they're from is a racial microaggression. You have Harvard that says that fat phobia is a form of violence. You have schools where it's silly things like distributing sushi in the school dining hall is a form of cultural appropriation. Doing yoga is cultural appropriation. It's like there's all this like little speech policing that's going on all over the country. So you can understand people are frustrated then when they hear what they believe should be unprotected calls for genocide, and the college and university presidents fall back on freedom of speech arguments. But the argument is not when colleges and universities are exercising double standards and being hypocritical to censor more speech. No, it's the answer is to end the censorship, end all of the silly censorship and hypocritical double standards that have existed for decades.
Yeah. Now, actually, a commenter just said, but consistently enforced hate speech code laws are far better than inconsistently enforced ones. No, none of them are good. The reducing because this is a point that Alan Charles Kors makes, the University of Pennsylvania professor who co-founded FIRE, is that speech codes have always relied on double standards because they can't work without them. Because if you actually enforce them by the plain language of the codes, nobody would be allowed to say anything. Everybody would be prosecuted under them, and so therefore they wouldn't last a minute. So the answer can't be reducing everyone to silence on any important topic. But that seems to be where some people's minds are going, and that means FIRE is going to have to work even harder over the next several years to prove how utterly foolish such an idea is, particularly in a place that relies on the marketplace of ideas to produce knowledge.
Greg, we should talk briefly. We have a question from a listener asking about Title VI and obligations under that regarding hostile environment harassment. Now, my understanding is Title VI doesn't cover religion, but it's been interpreted through agency guidance to cover religion and ethnic origin and national origin. So can you talk a little bit about the standards for hostile environment harassment in particular in this context?
Well, when it comes to student-on-student harassment, if it's targeted, severe, persistent, and pervasive, are some of the and discriminatory, then it can actually rise to the level of harassment. And whereas we see that the harassment standard abused on campus all the time, and we've made this argument repeatedly, and in fact, the speech codes that were products of the 80s and 90s, what I call the first great age of political correctness, in Reason magazine and also in Canceling of the American Mind, they were all harassment-based codes. Harassment was kind of the sort of code word to sort of get around free speech. Because harassment is a real thing, but if you define harassment simply as offensive speech, then it's just simply a speech code. And all of these were overturned that were challenged from 1989 to 1995, including at my alma mater, the very last one at my alma mater, Stanford Law School. But we do absolutely, and have argued consistently that severe, persistent, targeted, severe, persistent, and pervasive targeted discriminatory harassment is something that can and should be punished. And whereas a lot of times we've seen that invoked in situations that come nowhere close to the line, we're seeing a lot more situations where it comes a hell of a lot closer to the line lately. I mean, the ugliness of some of the interaction we're seeing on campus, including things like the true threats at Cornell, and students actually being grabbed or trapped in libraries. That's none of that is protected, nor should it be.
We have a question here from a listener. Is there a university that you can use as an example of the right way to handle the current tumultuous Israeli-Palestinian discourse, who is excellent excelling at promoting free speech? I was actually on Jake Tapper on Friday debating this issue with Fred Lawrence who was a former president of Brandeis, and I was talking with Jake either before or after the appearance, and he's a trustee at Dartmouth. He was talking about some of the things that the new president at Dartmouth is doing.
Yeah.
He was saying that they haven't seen, excuse me, some of the conflagrations that some of these other campuses have seen. He believes in part because of the efforts by the president and everyone at the top of that administration to set up opportunities for civil discourse across lines of difference. Whether that'll work at every college or university, it's hard to say. But Greg, I know you are pretty optimistic about what's going on over at Dartmouth.
I have great hope there, and I say that very cautiously because I've had hope in other universities before and have been bitterly disappointed. But at the same time, I think University of Virginia is trying hard to be good on free speech, and they actually ended up in the top 10 of our campus free speech ranking, one of the only well-known elite schools to do that. University of Chicago does well. But some of the stuff that Dartmouth is trying right now, I really like it. And the idea of opening up from day one, something like we've been advocating from the beginning, not saying here is your bias-related incident hotline to call and report your fellow students and professors for saying offensive things, to set them up initially to be kind of like, listen, understanding the world is difficult. Truth is very hard to attain. It's a never-ending process. Read Jonathan Rauch. It's something that it's never actually finished, and it's always up for continuing debate and refinement, and you'll never be done. And one of the things that one of the many things I think Dartmouth is doing right is that they started having serious dialogues about Israel-Palestine months ago. You don't wait for the crisis to hit. You try to see what might come up, and then try to get people talking across lines of difference. Trying to take the other person's point of view, like a good scholar should be able to do. And that actually depolarizes. That's the way to use free speech, to depolarize rather than polarize. Because it's really hard once you've taken someone else's perspective or know them better, or at least argued with them face to face, to think that your opponent must be stupid or evil. Something else that I thought was pretty clever that Dartmouth is doing is they're doing a lot more co-teaching with professors who don't see eye to eye on various topics. This is something that I know Cornell West and Robbie George did very effectively at Princeton. And it was one of those ideas that I realized that I hadn't given as much thought to as being very smart. because we do have a serious problem, a serious sort of gloom on the horizon for free speech on campus, is that according to our own surveys and a lot of existing data, the rising sort of crop of younger professors tend to be even more politically homogenous and not as good on free speech and academic freedom as boomers and we awesome Gen Xers. Sorry, we're the best generation. And that's distressing. But one way to make that matter a little bit less is to have more co-teaching with professors who disagree. And I think that's modeling that's modeling intellectual humility. I think that's modeling the ability that we want all students to have to be able to be conversant in multiple sides of any given topic, like a good scholar should be. And I talk about this in my first book, Unlearning Liberty, which came out in 2012. And my argument in there was, are we training activists or are we training scholars? And what's funny is, in the 90s and in the early part of my career, campuses were constantly saying, we're not training activists, we're not doing that, that's not something we do at all. And now they don't even bother to say that they're not doing that. They actually kind of lean into the fact that that's kind of the mentality that they're training. But that's not a very scholarly approach to it. Like that essentially the idea of coming to issues with taking seriously the possibility you might be wrong and knowing that you have stuff to learn, that's a much more scholarly attitude. And it's something about understand the world before you try to change it.
There was, the conversation right now is all about whether calls for genocide are protected speech. But early in this conflict, after October 7th, one of the big topics of conversation was institutional neutrality. That is, should colleges and universities be neutral on social and political issues, and whether the attacks by Hamas on October 7th were something that colleges and universities should weigh in on, much in the same way that they weighed in on the George Floyd protests, the Dobbs abortion decision, the elections, the list goes on and on and on and on. And folks often folks who are in support of institutional neutrality refer back to the Calvin Report, which was issued by the University of Chicago in 1967 in response to just a number of demands by the community internally and externally to weigh in and take official institutional positions on social and political issues. And ultimately what the report, and it's about a page and a half long, I'd urge folks to check it out. You just Google the Calvin Report, Calvin spelled with a K. Ultimately, what the university determined was that their institution is created for the purpose of the dissemination, preservation, and creation of knowledge, and that the university itself and its administration is the host of critics, but they themselves are not the critics. The critics are the students and faculty who are engaged in the knowledge generation process, who have the debates and the discussions about the social and political issues. And what we found is that as colleges and universities have weighed in more on these issues, they're getting themselves into quagmires, right? Like, you weigh in on one issue, you weigh in on George Floyd, you weigh in on the Dobbs decision, you can expect that if you don't weigh in on, say, the attacks on October 7th, that people are going to impugn political motivations for not doing so. And also, we've seen over the years that as institutions have been perceived, and in some cases are, more politicized, trust in those institutions decline. And colleges and universities cannot survive if they lose the public trust. And unfortunately, as recent polling has shown, public trust in colleges and universities is declining precipitously. So, Greg, I'm wondering if you have anything you want to add about the Calvin Report, institutional neutrality, and whether colleges and universities should, in fact, adopt statements like the one that the University of Chicago did in 1967.
Yeah, I came in, when I started in 2001, I wasn't a big fan of the Calvin Report. I didn't really see the harm in university presidents, opining on issues of the day, particularly if that was instead of the temptation to punish students or professors for what they had to say. So there would be some cases, like at University of Pennsylvania, where a university president would, I remember there was a party that Republicans have where the entire goal was to be as offensive as possible. And so that meant, people showed up, dressed like Nazis, and other sort of, offensive costumes. And what the president, and this was actually Graham Spanier at the time, called the students out, saying that this was offensive and juvenile, but protected. And I was like, you know what? If that's what he's going to do instead of punish them, I can live with that.
And that was Penn State, right, Greg?
Penn State. Yeah. That's when I came to. But over the years, I came to realize that every time a university president, or for that matter, a department opines on a particular political issue, they are doing something that is antithetical to what a university is supposed to be. They are establishing a political orthodoxy. They're basically saying, this on this campus, we believe, it's like those signs that people have outside of their houses. On this campus, we believe the following things. And that is not what the role of a university, or again, for that matter, a department should be. That essentially they should be hosts to the critics, not the critics themselves, as the Calvin Report says. So I've become very pro Calvin Report, but I think it's a good beginning. It's not nearly enough. And also, when it comes to the timing of the discovery of the Calvin Report for some of these schools, October 7th happened, utterly horrifying attack. And universities who have opined on every other, major incident, from the war in Ukraine to certainly George Floyd, to things of much lesser global importance, that's appealed to them from a political stance. They were much more cautious, measured, and I think in many situations, university presidents who were very supportive of Israel and were horrified by the attacks, they were scared to actually say what their opinion was on that. And I think they were scared of, forgive the expression, cancel culture. I think they were afraid of their own students. I think they were afraid of their own activists. They were afraid of their own administrators, and they're afraid of their own faculty about the blowback, because the pro-Palestinian stance on some colleges is not necessarily a majority stance, but very strong. And in the polling, it's very popular among young people. It's very popular among professors. So the decision to then decide that they have institutional neutrality was rightfully criticized by our advisory council member Larry Summers and our board member Sam Abrams. So I get that. But I think that ultimately, if universities adopt neutrality and stick with it, they'll be better off long term. But here's where my skepticism really comes in. And I have a Substack. I can say that on this version of X. I have a Substack called The Eternally Radical Idea, where I talk about a lot of these cases, and they've been coming at a breakneck pace, of course, lately. And my cynicism comes from, again, my experience in 9/11. Campuses are really good at circling the wagons, claiming that it's a new McCarthyism. The term comes up a lot. When the threat to academic freedom is perceived or actually coming from off campus, when it's coming from, and which includes people like donors, which include people like alumni, and then they actually sort of clothe themselves in the language of academic freedom and free speech. But when the threat comes from on campus, from student activists, from professors, from administrators, and oftentimes it's student activists and administrators, and sometimes professors kind of working together, they're completely cowardly. So I need years of schools being good on this kind of stuff to even begin to believe them that they're sincerely changing their ways, particularly at schools that have been as consistently bad as Harvard and Penn.
I think we're still here. Your mention of Substack, Greg, didn't deplatform us.
I thought we'd immediately get shut down. Oh no, we mentioned the forbidden site.
You mentioned donors, Greg. I think a lot of folks have questions about kind of donors' involvement in everything that's going on at these colleges and universities. For years, FIRE have said that alumni and donors and boards of trustees can provide helpful pressure in getting colleges and universities to recommit to principles of free expression. There have been some calls from donors in this current context which aren't always free speech friendly. How are you looking at all of that, and what guidance can we give to donors now so that they keep these colleges and universities on the right track?
Yeah. So when it comes to donors, we have an issue with donors if they're saying fire this professor or expel these students for their speech. That is not something that's where we draw the line. But if donors are saying, you know what, this place sucks, I'm not giving my money to it anymore, partially with my own hat on, it's like damn right. Like the idea that a mega corporation, Harvard, that has over $50 billion in their rainy day fund, which
You
is
mean a mega hedge fund?
mega hedge fund needs your $100 million, is crazy. And give that give that money to fire, give that money to University of Austin, give that money to what Sal Khan is doing with School USA to actually figure out ways to actually invest in other things in the meantime. Don't let them say, "Oh, we will fix this." Keep your money until they have fixed it and shown they have fixed it for a while.
Or build new institutions.
Or build new institutions. We desperately need that. So I think that the universities have become too reliant on the idea that they're kind of almost owed this ridiculous amount of extra money. I remember when I was at Stanford, when we would get alumni pledges, and one of my friends looking at me kind of like, Walmart doesn't ask me for extra money. And I think Walmart has less money than Stanford. I think that donors can play a very positive role. I think that they should be pushing, and we are here and happy to help. And I think that some of the steps that need to be taken are painful. I think that it's going to be very difficult to fix the free speech problem on campus without fixing the hyper-bureaucratization problem. I say this over and over again. They're very closely related. But I think now there's enough skepticism about what's going on in higher ed that I think real reform is possible. And meanwhile, kind of like it's interesting for me because writing Canceling the American Mind, talking about all these cases, talking about how dysfunctional the way campuses have taught us to argue, to win arguments without winning arguments, about all these rhetorical fortresses, as we call them in the book, that they've set up that will never get you anywhere near truth. It left me pretty, frankly, depressed and anxious, about the book coming out, because it made me feel pretty bleak about the potential future for higher ed. And even though things are looking pretty bleak right now, at least I'm getting the sense that people are waking up to, oh wow, this is as crazy as maybe Haidt and Lukianoff and Fire have been saying for a long time. So as I said on Bill Maher, welcome to the party.
Yeah, well, you got talking about some potential solutions there, Greg. You got talking about the debureaucratization. We talked a little bit about building new institutions, which I know is one of Barry Weiss's big bugaboos at the moment. It reminds me of the Sam Rayburn quote, Sam Rayburn being the old Speaker of the House in Congress, who said, any jackass can kick down a barn, but it takes a good carpenter to build one. I think we need more good carpenters at the moment. But I think, and I'm hopeful that this, Greg, this moment will help universities rediscover their missions. And Fareed Zakaria talked a little bit about this on his program over the weekend, and he had a clip that went viral. It's about 5 minutes that kind of encompasses what his opinion is the main problem with colleges and universities. And he says that universities have supplanted the truth-seeking function of a university with social justice causes and DEI efforts. And I know your co-author on The Coddling of the American Mind, Jonathan Haidt, talks a lot about the telos of a university. What is the core purpose of a telos of the university? And he talks about how universities can only really have one core purpose, just kind of like a planet only has one axis that it can spin on. And if you try and spin on multiple axes, multiple teloses, things get all jiggered up, right?
Piggly.
Yeah, I was trying to figure out a good silly word to describe that. But we've seen it in some of the conversations surrounding the most recent issue, that every challenge is also an opportunity, right? You said you're going to need years to see whether that one plays out, but what are you thinking about the missions of colleges and universities at the moment?
I think that there has been that a lot of university presidents seem almost uncomfortable with saying that the role of this university is truth-seeking. And they talk about multiple other things, many laudable things like diversity and inclusion. But at the same time, and this was a very strange thing to have to explain to it's not going to sound a very nice way to put it, but to educated people, that I dealt with some activists, friends of mine, who didn't understand what Haidt was saying. It's like, no, we want to serve both truth and social justice. And the problem is that you already think you know what social justice is. You already think you know what tree to push against, what the agenda should be. That's certainty. That's unscholarly certainty. You're starting with assumptions about what it must look like. Intellectual humility is saying maybe we're wrong about all this stuff. Alice Dreger, in her great Galileo's Middle Finger, makes the point that truth is a necessary precondition to social justice. But it's not the function of the university to figure out social justice. It's to figure out what the world actually looks like, which is surely a difficult enough task. And by the way, if you have preconceived notions of what it must look like, you're going to get an increasingly distorted picture, which is, I fear, one of the things that's happening right now. It's one of the reasons why people don't take many academic experts as seriously as they once did, is because they sense that in some cases they'll place ideology above truth-seeking. And unfortunately, I've seen indications of this all throughout my career. I've seen a lot of scholars actually making the argument that essentially, there's this amazingly bad book written by two AUP, American Association of University professors, called "It's Not About Free Speech." And during one of the worst threats to free speech and academic freedom I'm familiar with since the law has been established, the worst threat. We talk about, over 200 professors being fired, which is twice as many as professors that we know of were fired, that we knew at the time of McCarthyism. We're dealing with a very serious situation. And there are people actually arguing that we have to actually now limit academic freedom to anything that might present white supremacy. And in the course of making that argument, they actually argued that they meant the CRT version of white supremacy, which is basically anything that they disagree with. So I think that universities have strayed very far from the idea that truth-seeking is their function, and we need some bold university presidents saying that is first and foremost what we're here for. We are here for promoting inquiry and taking seriously the search for truth by slashing away at falsity.
Yeah, I want to remind folks we've got about 15 minutes left here. If you have questions, please put them in the chat, and our social media guy will feed them on over to us to answer. Greg, you talk a lot about epistemic humility, and it reminds me of an experience I had when I was in college at Indiana University, where this fundamentalist evangelical pastor, Douglas Wilson, came to campus. Folks who are familiar with him might know him from his nationwide tour with the late, in my opinion, great Christopher Hitchens, who had died in 2011, and Douglas Wilson came to Indiana University's campus shortly after his passing. And I'm a big fan of Christopher Hitchens, and this was my opportunity as a student at Indiana University to play Christopher Hitchens and to debate Douglas Wilson. But no sooner had he stood up to start talking that my fellow students at Indiana University started shouting him down. And I'll never forget a line he had as he was being shouted down. He said, "I always think I'm right, but I don't think I'm always right. I always think I'm right, but I don't think I'm always right." And I think that phrase, Greg, perfectly encapsulates this sort of epistemic humility that any good scholar should approach colleges and universities with. It's this idea that we'll have strong convictions loosely held. And you talk, Greg, about how the admissions process for students should help kind of encourage these values and screen students for those who are interested in talking across lines of difference and playing devil's advocate and thought experimentation, rather than some of the current social justice causes that are used to screen out students in admission. I mean, it struck me that in this Douglas Wilson experience, these people were so certain in their beliefs that they didn't let Douglas speak, and they wouldn't let anyone else in the audience who wanted to hear him listen. They were so certain in their beliefs that they thought nobody else should have the right to engage with what he had to say. And I don't think that's a fundamentally scholarly way to approach the college and university experience.
That's something that we oppose at every level are the political litmus tests. And although we focused on things like DEI statements as being obviously political litmus tests when it comes to hiring your professors, a lot of universities in their application process, one, they actually now require DEI statements, which can't help but be political litmus tests. We actually explain this in great detail in Canceling the American Mind. But also, there's going to be an excerpt running in Reason magazine pretty soon called "The Conformity Gauntlet," kind of explaining, the research that confirms the obvious truth that DEI statements are political litmus tests. But they're not the only political litmus test, and that university, seem to be asking their students to show, like, are you the right kind of activist instead of are you the right kind of scholar? I'd certainly remember when I was applying to Stanford, because I have great activist cred. I've been working with inner city high school kids on environmental mentoring programming. I've been, set up an aid to refugee program when I was young. But at the same time, and that's all swell. But in many ways, I think it's more important that I worked at Burlington Coat Factory and was a cook on Block Island, and had 20 different jobs since I was 11. Because that taught me, to talk across lines of difference, to actually know people from different countries and strata and regions. And what I'm getting at is right now that essentially there is a political litmus test for even students to get in, and that. But since it focuses on activism, it's going to give you disproportionately, people who come in pretty certain about they understand how the world works and how it needs to be fixed before they've actually even started their education. Meanwhile, if instead what you prioritized was someone showing that they're filled with curiosity, and that they don't know everything, and that they want to learn and they want to listen, that would be really powerful. Now, of course, the question is, like, how are they going to achieve that? How can we trust these administrators, to achieve that? And part of the argument is, rather than even doing this kind of stuff at all, that, as Evan Mandry points out in his excellent book, Poison Ivy, maybe it actually should be something where, all valedictorians from public schools in a particular area, get the opportunity to be admitted to various schools. That could actually potentially be a better system. I feel like you need some objective criteria. And if it was based less on figuring out whether or not I like the ideology of someone and more on objective standards, I think some of this problem might actually start to address itself. But if you're going to be selecting for characteristics, don't select for epistemic certainty and arrogance. Select for people who are actually like, I want to know the world. I want to spend the rest of my life swimming in the ocean of knowledge and knowing that I'll never get anywhere close to the shore.
Now, viewpoint diversity for faculty, Greg, I read a statistic not too long ago that said that I think that for every for every one conservative professor, there were 2 liberal professors. This was in the 1980s, but now it stands at about 8.5 to 1, 8.5 liberal professors to 1 conservative professor, and it's even higher than that, much higher than that in some departments and some liberal arts colleges. What does the lack of viewpoint diversity on college campuses, what's the impact on freedom of expression and the search for truth? And if you would kind of speak to the impacts on polarization as well, and Cass Sunstein's work on the law of group polarization.
Yeah, I had I got my best distillation of sort of explaining the relationship between group polarization and freedom of speech today that I retweeted. And I was talking about the hate speech laws that I'm told have not quite been passed in Ireland, but giving the example of what they actually did in France, because France passed hate speech laws, like laws against anti-Semitic speech, a long time ago. And by every measure, anti-Semitism has gotten worse in France since they passed them. And I don't think that's not only just in spite of the hate speech codes. I think it's partially because of it. Because, one thing I say is, if you're fighting people who believe there's a conspiracy to shut them up, do absolutely nothing that looks like a conspiracy to shut them up. That plays into their paranoia. But also, basically what France was saying, since they don't seem to get that censorship doesn't change anyone's mind, is only talk to people who agree with you. So your plan is what? Have all the anti-Semites only talk to other anti-Semites, and then you're shocked that anti-Semitism gets worse? Obviously, you should have seen that coming. So group polarization is a very normal, natural, pernicious, common sense, psychological phenomena. When it comes to viewpoint diversity on campus, that's one of those issues where it's not, it's something that I very much agree with Jonathan Haidt about. That it's hard to be too optimistic about the future of higher ed if it just continues to get less and less politically diverse and more, politically pushed in one direction. Because in order to, fight that sort of intellectual certainty, that groupthink, you need some people going, actually, I think what you're saying is BS. I reject your fundamental premises. Let's hash it out. And so it is a question for us, like, can universities actually, fix themselves without committing to having greater viewpoint diversity? And it's very hard to see a way that they can do that. It's not, it's not an official fire position, but we do paint over this quite a bit. So that's one of the reasons why I kind of like the idea of having co-taught classes with people who disagree, because that would create a situation in which part of the requirement is to actually find professors who disagree with other professors to work in various schools.
Well, as I said earlier in this conversation, Greg, every crisis is also an opportunity. And so, what do you see as the most likely path forward? Are you optimistic? Are you pessimistic? Just what is your psychological state right now?
My psychological state is I think 2024 is going to be an incredibly polarizing year, no matter what, particularly with an election coming up. And I think that we're going to see an increase in cancel culture next year. I very much hope to be wrong. I think that there is a level of sort of skepticism about what's going on in higher ed to help potentially lead to positive changes there. And I really do think that it could, because even if it was just on cost alone and bureaucratization, the fact that universities have been putting people into tremendous debt while at the same time primarily focusing on growing their bureaucracies is something that every American should be pretty annoyed about. So I think that reform, this was unsustainable. It could not keep going this way, and we have to seriously address it at some point. So I have greater hope for meaningful reform now. Could that meaningful reform, though, go completely the wrong direction? I sure as hell hope not, but I once again offer, Fire's help and advice to make sure that it doesn't go in that direction.
You ready for a nice, relaxing holiday season here, Greg?
Oh yeah, no, I don't. I'm just getting ready to sip this cup of coffee. Nothing's going to happen.
Some mulled wine might be better at getting through this current moment, but I think we're going to wrap it up here, folks. I wanted to mention, if you like what Fire is doing and you want to fight for the cause of free speech, we're building a free speech army. We launched a membership program earlier this year where you can become a Fire member, a $25 donation. You'll get a Fire membership card, invitations to exclusive events, and you can do that by going to thefire.org. There should be a button at the bottom that says become a member now, or if you just go up to the donate button at the top, it should siphon you in the right direction. But we're, again, trying to build a free speech army with a membership program. We already have over 10,000 Fire members, and we'd love to have more principled free speech advocates in our corner advocating for these timeless principles of free speech, academic freedom, freedom of the press, and frankly, the just basic right to be who you are and to speak your mind. I should also note that this conversation we will run as a podcast on my podcast called, So to Speak, the Free Speech Podcast. If you enjoy conversations like this, we host conversations like this on a multitude of topics every other week. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And also, do not forget, buy Greg's new book, Canceling of the American Mind. He's out there doing a ton of media about it. It couldn't be more relevant to this current moment. Greg, do you have any last thoughts before we sign off?
That it makes a great stocking stuffer for people who assured you cancel culture is a hoax.
All right, folks, thanks for tuning in. We appreciate all of your listening and support, and we'll talk again soon.
Absolutely. Great chatting with you.